these questions during the Q&A section of the webinar. Please also follow along on social media. We encourage you to do this using the Twitter handle shown on the slide here, as well as the hashtag SHLB webinar. With that, I wanted to introduce today's panelists. First, I'll provide a brief overview of Pew's work, and then Crystal Ivey is the Broadband Director at the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, and she'll talk about the great work going on in Tennessee, followed by Teresa Ferguson, the Director of Federal Broadband Engagement for the Colorado Broadband Office, who will share more about Colorado's broadband efforts. And then Eileen Harris, the Development Director at Human IT, which is an organization in California that works on providing access to technology. So with that, I wanted to share a little bit about Pew's research, focusing on how states are expanding broadband access. And with the challenges recently with coronavirus, this has really increased attention to this issue of broadband connectivity and how Americans are working and learning from home and really need access to high speed and reliable internet. It's really becoming increasingly evident. Over the last several years, a number of states across the country have been taking a leadership role and have established programs and enacted policies to really address gaps that exist in broadband access and help close the digital divide. Next slide. So in February 2020, Pew published a report that focuses on the state-led broadband initiative and the efforts that states have taken to address challenges and expand broadband access. Next slide. To provide just a little bit of background on how we conducted this research, we started a little over a year ago now, looking across all 50 states and getting a sense of what state policy and state broadband programs look like across the country. From there, we narrowed it down to a set of case study examples, 9 states across the country, including Tennessee, Colorado, and California. And we conducted field research in those states. We visited each of those states, and we conducted interviews with the state broadband program staff, with grantees of those broadband programs, and with a number of other stakeholders who are engaged in broadband in those states, including local government entities, broadband coalitions, and others. Next slide. So from there, we identified a set of practices that we see in states across the country, and these are things we really see across programs, across states that are making meaningful progress towards closing the digital divide. So these 5 practices are shown here. The first is stakeholder outreach and engagement. This one, really informs all of the other practices, and we see states engaging a range of stakeholders, recognizing that broadband touches a number of policy areas from education to healthcare, and stakeholders at both the state and local levels. The next is establishing a policy framework. And state policy frameworks are important. They establish goals, they identify and address barriers to broadband deployment, and they can be used to connect broadband to other policy priorities like economic development. The third practice is planning and capacity building. And planning and capacity building really provide the bridge between planning and implementation. We see states investing in planning activities at both the state and local levels. The fourth practice is funding and operations, and this is really states providing funding for these efforts, setting up grant programs, and providing support for broadband deployment and digital inclusion efforts. And the final practice is program evaluation and evolution, and this is states collecting data, using data to evaluate and understand the impact of their programs and inform the next steps. Next slide. So we also, in addition to the practices, identified a a few things that we refer to as the near universal truths of broadband, but a number of things that we saw across states as and that stakeholders identified as really important to the success of programs. One was the value of leadership coming from the executive and legislative levels and really moving broadband efforts forward. The next was the value of having people dedicated to these efforts, having dedicated staff who can respond to and support broadband deployment efforts, who can answer questions, who can, not currently, but in other times, show up for meetings across different parts of the state. And the final piece here was that people, different stakeholders really saw their state broadband programs as trusted partners and resources, and as advocates for the deployment of broadband and not for necessarily one stakeholder group or another. So just really a neutral resource for information on addressing this challenge. Next slide. And then there were a couple additional common characteristics that we found that were really important to this conversation. One is that it really is a multifaceted challenge. There are a number of things that make continuing to reach the remaining unserved Americans that make that a challenge. And so there's no one single solution that will solve this challenge. It's a challenge that takes time and resources. And the process of getting there can also be important. It helps educate stakeholders, it gets people on board, and it helps make sure that, when broadband is deployed, that people are making full use of those networks. So with that, I will turn it over to Crystal to talk about the work that they are doing in Tennessee.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to Pew for your work in elevating this really important issue. And thanks again to Shelby for inviting me to be a part of the conversation. We're doing a few things in Tennessee related to digital inclusion, and I hope that this is something that other states and stakeholders can replicate. Next slide, please. So in Tennessee in 2017, we passed the Broadband Accessibility Act. And that legislation is looking at addressing the broadband gaps that are across our state, both in accessibility and adoption, in three specific ways. The first is a funding component. Anna mentioned that there was a funding component that she's seeing across states. In Tennessee, and specifically, we are addressing that through infrastructure and adoption. So the infrastructure piece is a grant program for broadband providers. We award funding directly to the providers to assist them in deploying infrastructure out into unserved areas. We also had a deregulation component where we allowed providers that were not typically or entities that were not typically broadband providers, allowed them to get into the broadband business. Specifically in Tennessee, those were electric membership cooperatives. And lastly, and what we're going to talk about today, is the education or digital literacy component. This was included in the legislation. I think it's really important that it was included there. It showed just how crucial this is to be a part of the conversation. It's not just about the access itself, but it's also about even for folks who have access to the infrastructure, may not be able to sign up for service for various reasons. In Tennessee, less than 50% of folks that have access to the infrastructure actually subscribe to the service. So this legislation, this component of the legislation, is focused on digital inclusion and adoption as part of that conversation. Next slide, please. So in Tennessee, we have a program that we work with the local libraries across the state to offer free digital literacy classes, equipment, Wi-Fi hotspot devices, and some other things to encourage the use of broadband in that community. Really, for us, it was important that not only the infrastructure grants be included in the legislation, but also a focus on digital literacy. I think when we're talking to our stakeholders, particularly legislators and other funders, it was important to talk to them about, hey, the state is investing funds in this infrastructure, and we want people to actually use it. We want communities to be able to maximize the full benefits of that infrastructure. So these classes are incredibly popular, being offered all across the state on various topics. The hotspot devices there's a waiting list for these at every library. Of course, that's not a long-term solution for our communities. We want everyone to be able to access infrastructure at home, but it's certainly a short-term solution and something that can offer another access point to folks out in the community that don't currently have access to broadband. Next slide, please. So these classes, they range in topics from very kind of simple basic topics like privacy and security online, how to sign up for an email, applying for jobs or filling out a resume, accessing your medical benefits online, those things that some of us take for granted that we know how to do. If you've never had access to broadband at home or don't own a device, these are things that you may not know how to do. So these class topics are very basic from those items to also more advanced topics. On the previous slide, we saw a couple of students working on some coding. So we have classes related to STEM and photo editing and coding for students. It's really whatever the specific needs are for the community. And we love our libraries. We love our community anchor institutions. They're already doing really great work out there. So we want to give them some flexibility on the types of classes that they offer because they are really the boots on the ground and they know what our communities need. We also ask them to advertise these classes. I have a screenshot here of an advertisement in the local paper. I know for some of us that may seem like maybe that's not the best way to reach people now, but if you don't have access to the internet, social media might not be the best place to advertise digital literacy classes. So we want to make sure that the folks, the audience that we're looking for, we're marketing to those folks as well and letting them know that these services are available. And we also market in places where the audience that we're looking for may gather or go, like community centers and community anchor institutions and other locations. Next slide, please. So this is just a map of kind of the last 3 years since that legislation passed in Tennessee. I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of where these grants have been awarded in Tennessee. So they've been all across the state, rural areas and urban areas. Again, adoption and digital literacy, it's not just a rural issue, it's an urban issue as well. We have awarded 133 grants for about $444,000 across Tennessee. So if you do the math, those are some pretty small grants. Just a few thousand for each project or each library. So for us, it's really not taken a lot of funding, but certainly just a continued focus, continue to make it a priority, and letting the libraries do what they do best, and that's meeting the needs of the communities. Next slide, please. So lastly, I wanted to talk about another way that we try to encourage adoption for that infrastructure grant program that I mentioned earlier. We have a application process, and one of the scoring components is adoption and digital literacy. So our broadband providers are applying for this funding. It's going to pay for construction and engineering and infrastructure to get service out into unserved areas. And we ask them, how are you going to encourage adoption in the grant area if we were to give you this funding? It's kind of requiring them to make digital literacy and adoption a priority. We're asking them, are you going to do more than your typical marketing that you were always going to do, or are you going to go beyond that? Maybe offer your own digital literacy classes, or hold community events, or offer discounted service plans. What are you going to do to help make sure that the community is maximizing the use of this infrastructure? And then the last thing I wanted to mention is we have a community resources page on our website. If you're a state or a community that maybe doesn't have the capacity necessarily to have a lot of programming around digital literacy. This is something that we have found that's been really helpful for communities, is to just have a landing page, a resource page of places they can go, whether that's funding or SHLB's website or the National Digital Inclusion Alliance or other folks that are working on this issue, particularly related to Tennessee. The Nashville Public Library does a lot of work. Tech Goes Home in Chattanooga. We just want to have all these resources available on one page so that communities, if they're looking at ways that they can help and be involved and support adoption within their community, they have a place that they can go. And next slide, please. So this is my contact information. I think we're going to take questions at the end, but I'm happy to take questions then, or if you want to email me offline, I'm happy to do that as well.
Great, thank you, Crystal. With that, we'll turn it over to Teresa Ferguson with the Colorado Broadband Office to talk about what they're working on in Colorado.
Well, hello, everyone. As Anna has said, I'm Teresa Ferguson. I'm the Director of Federal Broadband Engagement with the Colorado Broadband Office. Next slide, please. The Colorado Broadband Office was created in 2016 with the mission of enabling the development of a statewide communications infrastructure through public-private partnerships to meet the growing demand for broadband access for public safety, education, healthcare, transportation, economic development, and for all Coloradans. Next slide. The CBO lives our mission through leadership and by identifying funding sources for our communities, and by educating and providing opportunities for advocacy for our stakeholders. In leadership, we work across state agencies, coordinating our local, regional, and state broadband initiatives. In identifying alternative funding, we work with our stakeholders to identify federal money, state money, private investment opportunities, and any investment opportunities that would support the broadband needs of that community. We also provide information and education by meeting with communities, our regional councils of governments, or our local officials, and sharing our knowledge of state and federal funding opportunities. We host a monthly Lunch and Learn webinar on current topics, and we provide our statewide mapping initiative provides critical information for decision makers to provide them with reliable, anonymized, address-level broadband mapping data for the state of Colorado. We also advocate for our broadband for all Coloradans by engaging with federal and state and local policymakers and broadband providers, identifying opportunities for collaboration and investment. We share our Colorado broadband initiatives in our outreach to federal agencies and with our Colorado congressional delegates, always advancing the work of all of our state broadband stakeholders. Next slide. And the state of Colorado's made some progress we're pretty proud of. In 2019, the number of rural households with access to 25 meg down and 3 up increased from 77 to 87%. That is a 17% increase in rural connectivity since 2017. And as of 2019, 100% of Colorado school districts achieved the FCC's short-term broadband goals of 100 kilobits per student. We are looking at the long-term goals that the FCC has set for 1 megabit per student, and that's going to leave us with a little bit of work to be done. Since 2013, the Department of Local Affairs Middle Mile Broadband Fund has granted over $23 million in strategic planning grants and infrastructure grants. And earlier this year, DOLA announced that they would allocate another $25 million over the next 5 years for our state's middle mile broadband projects. Since 2016, the Department of Regulatory Affairs and our second broadband fund, which funds last mile funding for the state of Colorado, has awarded $26 million, almost $27 million in grants for 38 projects benefiting almost 20,000 Colorado homes, farms, and ranches. The state of Colorado's last mile broadband deployment efforts will be furthered by a USDA program round 1 Reconnect grant. Emory Telecom received $2.7 million to build fiber to the home to almost 500 unserved locations in Dove Creek, Colorado. We're also seeing a real interest in a aggressive outreach by our rural electric co-ops. Of the 22 co-ops that Colorado has, 5 of them are beginning to deploy fiber to the home to their members in Northwest, Southwest, South Central, and Southeast Colorado, providing simultaneous upload and download speeds of up to 100 megabits or gigabit service. And also, can't leave the cities out, over 140 Colorado communities, our cities and our counties, have actually opted out of a Colorado municipal ban that was put in place in 2005, which required municipalities to take to the vote of the people any initiative to bring broadband to their communities through a municipal broadband deployment. Those awards, or those votes of the people, have overwhelmingly ended with 60% and more majority vote for the communities asking their municipalities to provide broadband to their communities. Next slide. The state of Colorado has taken a to and through approach to broadband funding in our state. Our middle mile broadband funds connectivity to cities, counties, and anchor institutions, while our last mile broadband fund provides connectivity to homes, farms, and ranches. As I mentioned, DOLA funds strategic planning and infrastructure grants for middle mile projects, and they have previously to this year funded $20 million in those strategic planning and infrastructure grants, and they have recommitted to another $25 million over the next 5 years. Now, the local communities, municipalities, counties, and local governments are those that can apply, and they're required to bring a 50% match. This program has resulted in over 20 regional broadband development plans being completed. And that's reaching to our anchor institutions. The second fund in our state, the Department of Regulatory Affairs Broadband Deployment Fund, actually grants applications for last mile funding to unserved areas, which we define as 25-3 for the state of Colorado. In 2014, legislation of transitioned funds from our voice-only fund to our broadband fund, which has really increased the availability of funding for our middle mile, our last mile program. And applicants can expect up to 75% of their total project cost being funded through that last mile program fund. Next slide, please. I wanted to at least give you some concepts of geographic-wise what our middle mile project broadband fund has been funding. Project Thor is a result of hard work and dedication, and is a testament to the viability of public-private partnerships. Project Thor is a middle mile network comprised of more than 400 miles of existing public and private fiber optic cable, establishing high-speed connectivity through 14 communities across Northwest Colorado. It is an open access middle mile regional transport network that will provide lower cost aggregated bandwidth to Moffett, Routt, Jackson, Grand, Clear Creek, Summit, Eagle, Pitkin, Garfield, and Rio Blanco counties. The network will consist of a self-healing network for communities that do not currently have alternate paths and enabling community broadband initiatives in those areas. The network will connect Meet Me centers in each county, as well as anchor institutions. The project has been funded through Northwest Regional Council of Government and the Department of Local Affairs. Mammoth Networks has provided the network design and operation. Next slide. Another successful middle mile project in Colorado is our Region 10 project in Southwest Colorado. In 2015, Region 10 members recognized that the lack of adequate broadband services was impacting the economic development viability of their communities. They had seen over 900 coal mining jobs lost since 2013 at a cost of over $42 million in lost wages since 2014. And they'd actually lost population of about 1.4% between 2013 and 15. To overcome these economic challenges, Region 10 applied for funding from Colorado's Department of Local Affairs Middle Mile Regional Plan. They developed a regional plan through that grant funding source. The project wouldn't have happened if not for public-private partnerships that included Delta Montrose Electric, a rural electric cooperative, Tri-State Generation, Western State Colorado University and Gunnison County Electric Association, DOLA, and funding from the Economic Development Administration and our local governments. Thus far, the project has built or obtained access to more than 200 miles of infrastructure connecting from Grand Junction to Nucla, providing access to the communities of Delta, Montrose, Gunnison, Olathe, and Hotchkiss. Region 10 is currently working on completing connections to Cedar Ridge, Crawford, Paonia, Crested Butte, Ouray, and Ridgeway in conjunction with San Miguel County to reach Norwood, Telluride, and Mountain Village. As Region 10's network reaches these communities, private internet service providers can access a central location in the community to provide service to businesses and residents. Next slide. I wanted you to have a geographic image or view of the program or the locations that projects have been funded by the Department of Regulatory Affairs Last Mile Broadband Fund. Again, I mentioned earlier that's 38 projects that have reached 20,000 Colorado residences. And the state has put forward for funding of those programs around $27 million. Next slide. I wanted you to also see the number of cities across our state that are demanding broadband access and have gone to the voting booth to ask their local leaders to provide broadband solutions to their communities. As you can, the dots that you're seeing on that slide, that represents over 102 municipalities of our 271 that are incorporated in the state of Colorado, and 40 counties of our 60 in Colorado. So as you can see, the state of Colorado has taken an all hands on deck approach to bringing broadband to all Coloradans. I want to thank you for your time and I look forward to your questions. You can see I have my contact information up here for you, and I look forward to talking with you guys.
Great, thank you, Teresa. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, please type them in the chat box and we will do a Q&A session following Eileen's presentation. So with that, turn it over to Eileen Harris with Human IT.
Hi all, my name is Eileen Harris, and I just wanted to start today with a quick note of gratitude both to SHLB and Pew for putting this conversation together. As everybody mentioned, this conversation now more than ever. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation. So I'll share a little bit about the work that Human IT does. If we can hop to the next slide. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're based in Los Angeles, California. And our core mission is to shrink the digital divide. And so we provide low-income folks with access to free and low-cost computer hardware, assistance signing up to low-cost internet, and free digital training. And so as a part of that model, we actually take in what's known as e-waste, any unwanted technology from companies, and then we refurbish those items and donate it back out to low-income communities. And so as a part of our model, we really want to ensure that there's environmental sustainability built into this type of work. Since we were founded in 2012, we've been able to donate 13,000 devices, a combination of computers and laptops, all through partners that include schools, libraries, community-based organizations. We've also been able to connect 8,500 homes to low-cost internet, both throughout the state of California and throughout the entire United States. In addition, we've trained about 1,500 folks in digital literacy. And in a partnership with the California Public Utilities Commission, we look to train another 2,000 in the next 2 years. And beyond that, we've been able to divert about 4.7 million pounds of e-waste out of a landfill and back into the reuse stream. And so some of what our impact looks like today. And if we can go to the next slide as well, I want to talk about the importance of partnerships and being able to mobilize this impact. So I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that for a lot of folks on the call today, CBOs and anchor institutions are the front line of digital inclusion. You know, whether it was an organization designed purely for connecting underserved communities, or if you become a de facto practitioner, those partnerships become so vital in being able to connect families to the hardware, internet, and digital skills. And so Human IT, as a part of our impact, it's so important that we create those partnership ties with people who are on the front line. And so we know that libraries are an incredible resource, but as many of them are forced to shut their doors in these times, and or even during times when they are open, they have a really high demand for that public access. There is a need to connect as many folks as we can at home. And so as a part of the partnerships that we look to nurture, we have an outreach coordinator on staff. And that person's responsible for really establishing ties and relationships to community-based organizations throughout the state. And the reason partnerships become so key is because leveraging the trust of those partners, whether it's a librarian who has that face-to-face contact with the patron every day, if it's a case manager who's on the front line of helping folks who are looking to navigate their online social services, there's a really strong trust that's established between those frontline partners. And they also have the linguistic skills, the cultural skills to be able to communicate the need for these types of services. So what we do as a part of our program is our outreach coordinator works with about 70 to 100 organizations at a time and provides them with some official communication and materials to really outreach about low-cost internet options, as well as access to tech and digital literacy. So we'll provide some education to the staff about what's available, and also ask them to use some of their official communication channels to disseminate that information. So it may be, for example, a partnership with Los Angeles Unified School District. They'll do text blasts to parents, and they'll have newsletters that come directly from the LAUSD email that provide information about low-cost options, and also help connect them with a Human IT program staff. And that way we can really ensure that we're leveraging the trust and relationships that already exist within the community to spread the importance and really information about these types of programs. So as you can see, some of our partners include, we work with housing authorities like Los Angeles and Long Beach, also public libraries who again are on the front lines of digital inclusion, school districts, and also local city council members should create these types of programs. And once we've identified these partners, they'll be able to connect them with our staff. We'll provide some neutral guidance about what a person would qualify for based on their zip code and some of their income, what low-cost options are available to them, and then help walk them through that sign-up process to ensure they aren't upsold at any point in time. But beyond that, we also look to connect them with the devices and digital literacy as well. So we can hop to the next slide. Here's a couple examples of some of the digital inclusion programs that we've established that really speak to some of the federal, local, and state partnerships. I'm sure many are familiar with the Connect Home program. We were part of the pilot, and we're fortunate as a part of that pilot to have federal dollars to go towards all three legs of the stool. We were one of the largest housing markets in that rollout. So we were able to connect about 530 folks in a year's time to internet, computers, and training, which was really exciting. More recently, we've also partnered with, on a local level, our Mayor Eric Garcetti here as a part of a partnership with the local community college, who provides free tuition for low-income students and wraparound service like food, housing. We found a lot of those students were reporting the biggest barrier to completing that program was access to technology. And so we were able to provide about 4,200 devices that were refurbished, and then make sure each one has that ongoing technical support and the hardware warranty. And again, the assistance to low-cost internet. And so we'll find that, especially within these past 2 weeks, that partnership and the need has become especially vital, because all of those students are expected to do their learning remotely, leaving a lot of folks without the ability to do so. The last one I'll shout out here as well is Our Cycle LA. So this was a county partnership in which we were taking in all of the county's e-waste and we were refurbishing those devices. As we refurbished the devices, we were able to provide job training to, especially students in the area who are looking to get some STEM experience, some hands-on learning about how to refurbish technology. And once those items went back out to the community, we were also able, through a combination of corporate and foundation partners, get some prepaid and low-cost internet subscriptions out as well. So speaking to some of those partnerships. And we can move on to the next slide here as well. So at the state level, I wanted to talk about some of the partnerships that I think make these programs possible. One of which is a large partner of ours, the California Emerging Technology Fund, or CETF. And so CETF was actually formed during a merger of SBC Global and Verizon. And it was established as a state regulatory entity. So their role is they help to really advocate for legislation to ensure that underserved Californians have access to these digital resources. And they also oversee some grant-making opportunities and create partnerships between digital inclusion stakeholders. An example of one of the projects that we work with them on was a benefit fund. It was created as Frontier Communications had acquired about 5 million landlines through Verizon. And obviously, an acquisition that large, a lot of funds being transferred. CTF came to the table and really ensured that part of that funding and those revenues was going toward ensuring low-income people could still have access to internet connectivity and digital skills. So the grant program is structured in a way that CETF provides funding for each subscription that a grantee is able to facilitate. And also in that acquisition, Frontier had purchased 50,000 new Chromebooks. So for any qualified subscription, a family can walk away with a laptop as well to be able to fully utilize that connection. So it was I think just an opportunity to really capitalize on some of these larger mergers and acquisitions to make sure that underrepresented folks were being considered as they continue to expand their telecommunication services. So having folks like CETF who are there to really champion these types of funding opportunities and be in the ear of legislators as they're making this decision has been really crucial for us as well. Another example is the California Public Utilities Commission. And so traditionally, there's someone who has been, they work as a regulatory agency, but within the past couple of years, they've decided to prioritize grant making as well. And in doing so, they've recognized that, beyond just water and electricity, that internet is truly one of those essential utilities that everyone should have access to, which is really exciting. We're really fortunate that those conversations have happened at the state level. And I think it's a combination of a partnership between local consortiums, among cities and coalitions who have continued to voice that to the Utilities Commission. This is something that should be treated on the same level as water, electricity, and other utilities. And so the CPUC, they're able to, they created a surcharge on some telecommunication services that enabled $20 million to go toward internet connections as well as digital literacy programs. It's something that, beyond just having it be a transactional grant making process, it's been a really collaborative experience where they bring together, they'll have public hearings where they invite the commissioners, they'll invite internet service providers, they'll invite nonprofits, schools, libraries, all to engage in a conversation, at least annually, to talk about what are some of the challenges to being able to connect underserved communities, and what are maybe some of the barriers between both CBOs and ISPs to be able to really increase this impact. And so having those types of public forums to really discuss the challenges have been a huge help in being able to better facilitate these connections. Beyond that, as I mentioned, there's also a lot of local consortiums that happen both on a city level and a regional level. So the CPUC has a set of regional consortiums throughout California who represent each part of the state, which has its own set of needs, whether that be where I sit in Los Angeles, where we're fortunate to have a lot of the infrastructure, but some of our challenges really revolve around affordability and access. And so having conversations with how we can overcome some of those struggles, but finding maybe more in the Northern California where infrastructure becomes a larger barrier, they can have localized conversations about how to work through that. And so CPUC becomes convener for a lot of those conversations, and it's been a huge asset as well. I'll touch on one last point about other opportunities that have opened funding in unique ways. One of which has been at our city level. We'll find that we're always trying to find creative ways to build in public benefit funds to an RFP process. So it may be that a city is moving online to have a different set of software. So they're going out to bid to a lot of technology companies in the area. And so we've really encouraged that as a part of that bidding process, at least a portion of those funds would be going toward some type of digital inclusion program, whether that's hotspot lending, whether it's equipping libraries with more devices. We've also seen the same happen with small cell build outs as companies consider adding on 5G, starting those conversations if there's opportunities to ensure there's funding as a part of that contract that'll go towards digital inclusion. So we can go to one more slide here as well. And I know that was a lot of info, but I do encourage you all to reach out if there's any questions. The last thing I'll leave you with is in light of all the recent events, I know that there's been a really huge demand on folks in this call to connect their constituents with computers and internet at home. And so I do encourage you, schools, libraries, hospitals, really any partners who are finding gaps there, please feel free to reach out because we're doing our best to engage some partners in the philanthropy side to be able to provide this. And so there may be some resources that we can provide. But beyond that, thank you all, and I'm excited to continue this conversation.
Great, thank you, Eileen. We have a few questions, and please do feel free to continue to add questions to the chat box if you have any. The first question is, how do you expect the COVID-19 pandemic will affect the work or focus of state broadband offices or efforts going forward?
So this is Crystal. I mentioned, kind of answered this question a little bit in the question and answer box, but I think in Tennessee, we will continue focusing on funding the deployment of the infrastructure as well as funding digital literacy and our adoption efforts, continuing to work with our libraries. There are several states across the country that have funding for infrastructure, but there are not as many that have funding for digital literacy or adoption. So I'll be interested to see what the impact of the pandemic will be related to kind of the adoption piece. I think all of us on the call and all of us who work in broadband know the importance of connectivity for our communities, both rural and urban, but I think the issue is just being elevated at a level that we've never seen before. So I'll be interested to see how this is going to impact states and how they are funding broadband efforts, both infrastructure as well as adoption.
I couldn't agree more with what Crystal was just saying. It is, it's top of mind. It has brought home the point many of us have been trying to make for years, or for me, decades. We have to make broadband a priority. It is not enough just to fund to the anchor institutions. We have to fund and support programs that go to anchor institutions and through to the home. It is critical for our ability to actually leverage all of the economic development and human resources that we have available in our communities, both in our urban and our rural communities. Those rural communities are their lifeline is broadband. And I am so hopeful that going forward, the school closures and the closures of our, Main Street, small town America will be at the top of everyone's mind when they look at their infrastructure investments going forward, and putting broadband at the top of that list.
Great. And then the next question that we had was, in addition to Tennessee and Colorado, what states provide good models for broadband deployment? And I would be happy to start with this one, and then, Teresa, Crystal, and Eileen, if you want to jump in with your thoughts as well. In our report, we look at 9 states, and I think one thing that we do emphasize is states are different. They have different resource levels. They've been working on this for different periods of time. They have different political landscapes, different geographic landscapes. And then it also kind of depends on, as Crystal touched on, the focus on infrastructure deployment versus the adoption piece. So in the 9 states that we look at, in addition to the, 5 activities that we kind of see across all states, I think there are different things that can be learned from different states, not necessarily like a one-size-fits-all model. So there are states that have very successful infrastructure funding, like Colorado, like Tennessee, like Minnesota. There are states that have more activity in the digital inclusion and adoption space, like California and North Carolina, where a lot can be learned from their efforts there. So again, probably not one model, but a lot that can be learned from work that's being done in states across the country.
I agree with that point. And to add on as well, I think one thing that's worked particularly well when I think of large states, someone like Texas, and where you have a set of all of those types of needs, having those regional consortiums and stakeholders that represent those particular needs are especially powerful. But I think Pew did a great job of laying up some of those models in the report as well.
I can't list off directly each individual state that I respect and admire for all the work that they're doing, because everybody is kind of all hands on deck scrambling for the past couple of years trying to pull together our programs. But I would offer to the group to take a look at NTIA's Broadband USA State Program Broadband Programs Map. It will give you contact information and detailed information about each of those programs and contacts to reach out to. I would also offer to the viewers, look at Pew Charitable Trusts website on state broadband activities. They have a wealth of information on their website and a very great interactive tool that will provide you with the ability to look at statutes and programs for each state and how it impacts the broadband programs in that state. So those would be 2 great resources I would offer to the group that I can.
Great, thanks, Teresa.
I was just going to say ditto to what Teresa said.
I did want to ask Crystal, could you provide a little bit of background just on how the digital education and adoption piece was made a component of the initial legislation in Tennessee?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it seems like as states are developing programming around broadband, that the infrastructure piece is always kind of the popular thing or the thing that gets talked about the most. So in Tennessee, when we were developing the legislation and thinking about what should be included, for us, we wanted to make sure we were addressing it in multiple ways. And I think as we were talking to legislators and funders and explaining the importance of what should be included, I think it really appealed to them the message of, hey, if the state is going to invest funding into infrastructure, to deploy infrastructure out into our communities, we want it to have the maximum economic development impact that it can. And in order for it to do that, getting the wires in place, so to speak, is critical, but it's not the only component. There has to be a component to also encourage the adoption of that service. And so I think getting it included in the legislation, I think, elevated the issue even more. It showed all of the stakeholders, including the providers that are applying for this infrastructure funding, how seriously the state is taking the digital literacy part of the conversation, and how they should be making it a priority as well. And then the other part of that, I would say, is that I think some states are maybe a little bit concerned about their capacity and how there's so much going on. How can we possibly address digital literacy? And I would say to that, there are so many community anchor institutions and folks like Eileen who are out there doing great work, and there's certainly no need to reinvent the wheel. So I think including it in the legislation was kind of the state's way of contributing to the conversation and elevating it to make sure that it's part of the overall effort.
Great. And then we had another question, which are, what are some ways that you see or that have been successful for encouraging stakeholder participation throughout your state?
I'll jump in on that one if you want. It's really identifying the local champion in each community, because this work is local. Broadband is local. It's outreach. I know Crystal and I have talked about this. I mean, I think she's driven every highway in her state. My executive director, Tony Neal-Graves, and our team have been all over the state of Colorado for the past 3 years, identifying what those communities want to do, who they want to be, who they want their community to be. I think, Anna, you said earlier, one size fits all doesn't work. It absolutely is the worst thing you can do, in fact. And I think what we have found as the most successful is identifying those local champions, getting strategic funding out there for them to do strategic planning, but then also the money available to implement those strategic plans of what they want their community to look like with the economic development that broadband can bring. So it's person, money, and planning.
I completely agree. Yeah, and I think being able to activate those champions, whether that's a city council person, if it's a mayor, and also working through a community engagement plan amongst other nonprofits. So it may be an organization like a food pantry who in its core mission isn't designed as a digital inclusion practitioner, but so many of the people they serve have that need, and they can also serve their own need by providing that access. So I think equipping other organizations who maybe aren't by nature familiar with the type of work that we all do here today has been really powerful. And using some of their voice and the platform that they've created as well to continue to communicate that whenever there's a hearing, whenever there's some type of public convening, and continuing to bring, as we all build coalitions regionally around this type of work, bringing in folks who may not traditionally be digital inclusion practitioners is really essential as well.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that from our research, and we really see states, emphasizing that stakeholder outreach and engagement component as a core of these activities, and again highlight that across states in the report as something that that is really key to the success of these efforts. I think that those are all the questions that we've received. Teresa, Crystal, and Eileen, do you have any concluding thoughts or takeaways for today's webinar?
I would just say that I would just want to encourage everyone that's on the call to keep doing the good work that you're doing that's so impactful to our communities. Just thinking about that last question, how do you identify or encourage participation for stakeholders? For me, when I drive out to communities, they're just so thankful that someone is there talking to them, asking them how they can help. And so what you're doing is really meaningful work, and it really is making a difference in our community. So I would just encourage you to keep at it, to keep looking for resources, and please reach out to me if there's anything I can do to help.
I echo that 100%. And I know, as I mentioned before, that the demand is particularly high. So if y'all find yourself with the high volume of folks needing access to computers or internet, please don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you for continuing to be a part of this conversation.
Well, I dropped out for a second because my broadband went down. So I just want to continue to echo what Crystal and Eileen have said. Let's keep this at the top of everyone's mind. Our families, our homes, safety right now is the most important thing for everyone. But when we get through this, and we will get through this, I hope the best thing that comes of this, the silver lining for me, will be if we've identified where we need broadband, how we're going to fund that broadband, and set a national and state strategic plan to getting there, to solving this broadband deficiency that we're all kind of feeling right now. So I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you so much to SHLB for hosting today's webinar. As a reminder, the webinar and the recording will be posted to the SHLB website tomorrow, so it will be available there. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon.